The galaxy had long been ruled by fear, a fear that stretched across star systems, wrapped around countless species, and grew in the shadows of war-torn planets. The Iron Fangs, a formidable alien race with dark, obsidian skin and eyes like molten gold, had made their name through domination. For centuries they had burned through civilizations, crushing any who dared defy their will. They had proven themselves the unquestioned masters of war, until humanity, a species on the fringes of galactic recognition, unleashed its ultimate weapon, the Warborn. Jace Thorne, one of the Warborn, stood on the edge of the crumbling colony, his eyes scanning the horizon. The colony's once thriving streets were now silent, the smell of burning metal and shattered glass lingering in the air. This place had been humanity's last bastion, a desperate outpost on the edge of Iron Fang territory. Now it was nothing more than a hushed graveyard, a monument to the sheer power of their enemies. But there was something different about this war, something that the Iron Fangs had underestimated. Jace knew it. His comrades knew it. The Warborn had not been bred for survival. They had been bred for victory. Every part of their bodies had been enhanced for combat, their minds sharpened for strategy. They were more than just soldiers. They were humanity's best hope in a galaxy that had never truly seen what they were capable of. The Warborn were a secret weapon, born in a hidden human laboratory, created as living weapons of war. Their mission was simple: to tip the balance in the ongoing struggle against the Iron Fangs. But it was becoming clear that the human race had far more to offer the galaxy than just military might. Jace's squadron had arrived at this colony under the guise of reinforcement. The people here had been fighting, but their defenses were crumbling under the weight of the Iron Fang onslaught. When the Warborn descended from the skies, their heavy boots pounding into the cold earth, their enhanced senses already picking up the faintest whispers of movement, the Iron Fangs didn't know what hit them. Their first encounter was a brutal one. Jace and his squadron fought like ghosts, shadows in the night moving with deadly precision. But as the Iron Fang forces fell one by one, it became evident humanity's ingenuity was not to be underestimated. The Iron Fangs had always relied on their overwhelming strength and brutal tactics. Yet these new opponents, these Warborn, fought with a ferocity they had never witnessed. As Jace looked over the battlefield, a question gnawed at him. Was this truly the way to win the war? To defeat the Iron Fangs at their own game? Or was there something else, something deeper, that they should be fighting for? Despite the victory here today, a grim reality hung over Jace and his fellow Warborn. The war had only just begun, and their enemies would not rest until they had wiped out this unexpected threat. The Warborn knew no fear. They were not afraid of the Iron Fangs, nor of the cost that might come with this fight. But as Jace stood over the wreckage of the battle, watching the few survivors of the colony's defense being rounded up, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all being led into something far greater, something neither the Warborn nor the Iron Fangs had fully understood yet. He turned away from the carnage, the weight of what had just begun pressing down on him. The stars above, once distant and impersonal, now felt like a stage, a theater for the struggle of two species, one that would shape the fate of the galaxy forever. The attack came without warning. Jace had seen the reports, the alerts flashing across his visor's display, but nothing could have prepared him for the intensity of what followed. The Iron Fangs were relentless. They struck fast with a brutality that seemed otherworldly. It was as though they had known the Warborn were coming, waiting just long enough to ensure their dominance before unleashing hell upon the fragile human outpost. The colony was a mess of overturned buildings, flickering lights, and a terrifying silence in the aftermath of the initial bombardment. The few survivors had fled into the shadows, their hopes of defense dashed as soon as the Iron Fangs warships had descended from the skies. There was no place for fear on the battlefield. The Warborn understood that. At least, Jace thought. They did. But as his boots hit the cracked earth, his mind was elsewhere. The mission had been simple: defend, fortify, and strike back. But now, with the Iron Fang's ships looming overhead, and their ground forces charging with the ferocity of a species that had never known defeat, the reality of their situation began to settle in. Status report. Jace growled into his comms. His voice was steady, but underneath his heart raced. His team had scattered, each one securing their designated positions within the colony's periphery. The Warborn were made for this kind of warfare. Skirmy, faster. It was the one thing that had never been part of the Warborn's calculations. They had been bred to outpace their enemies, outsmart them, outlast them. But the Iron Fangs were not human. They were a terror incarnate, an ancient species, with a mastery of war that transcended anything the Warborn could have anticipated. And as the first clash occurred, with the war cries of the Iron Fang soldiers resonating through the air, Jace's worst fears began to crystallize. Humanity had underestimated the true power of the enemy. The Warborn's initial advantage, speed, surprise, and the sheer ferocity of their attacks, quickly proved insufficient against the Iron Fang's advanced technology and tactics. Jace's team darted between debris, taking cover, using every ounce of their genetic enhancements to outmaneuver the enemy. They moved with such precision that it almost felt like they were in a dream, but there was no time to marvel at their abilities, not when the enemy was closing in with relentless determination. The Iron Fangs were unlike anything Jace had ever fought before. Their soldiers were taller, stronger, faster. Their bodies were encased in thick armor that seemed impervious to all but the most powerful weapons. And the weapons they wielded, clawed gauntlets, energy shields, and brutal shock rifles, were designed to crush anything in their path. The Warborn, however, were no slouches. Enhanced senses, heightened reflexes, and a connection to technology that allowed them to adapt and evolve mid-fight made them formidable opponents. But even they were struggling against this new enemy. Jace saw one of his own comrades, an elite fighter named Elia, take a hit. She went down hard, the blast throwing her into the dirt, her body twitching, sparks of energy crackling through the air where her suit had been breached. His heart skipped a beat, but there was no time for hesitation. There was only action. "Elia!" Jace shouted, diving for her. But before he could reach her, an Iron Fang soldier closed the distance, its eyes locked onto him with a predatory gleam. Without thinking, Jace swung his weapon into position, the heavy gun crackling with energy. The blast that followed tore the alien soldier apart in a spray of green blood and sparks. He didn't look at the remains, there was no time. He was already moving to cover Elia, hauling her limp form onto his shoulder. "Status?" Jace barked again, sweat dripping down his brow, his breath quickening. The enemy was closing in and his team was starting to feel the pressure. "I'm fine," Elia gasped, though the blood soaking through her armor suggested otherwise. "We need to move. They're smarter than we thought." And she was right. The Iron Fangs were learning, adapting to the Warborn's tactics, countering every move with precision. Jace had always believed the Warborn to be the apex of military evolution, but now, facing the Iron Fangs in full force, he realized the painful truth. Humanity had created its own soldiers, but the universe was far older and more dangerous than they could ever imagine. The Warborn were supposed to be humanity's solution to this threat, but in this moment, Jace realized they were more than just weapons. They were the last hope of a species caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't start, fighting not just for survival, but for their place in the galaxy. And if they didn't adapt, they would be destroyed, just like so many others who had dared stand against the Iron Fangs. As the skirmish escalated, the war took on new meaning. It was no longer just about humanity surviving. It was about proving they had the will, the ingenuity, and the strength to challenge the galaxy's oldest and most feared conquerors. But the cost would be high, and the road ahead was filled with uncertainties. Jace had no answers. He only knew one thing. They could not afford to lose. This first taste of the conflict would propel them into a war unlike any they had ever imagined. The Warborn, born from the fires of human desperation, would need to evolve beyond their creation if they were to survive. And in the shadows of this brutal conflict, one question hung in the air. Could humanity truly outlast the Iron Fangs, or would they become just another species swallowed by the darkness of space? The dust had barely settled when the Warborn realized the true scale of what they had walked into. The Iron Fangs were not merely an enemy, they were a force of nature, one that could not be easily defeated by sheer will or strength alone. For the first time since their creation, Jace Thorne felt the weight of his existence. They were bred for this, bred to fight, to survive, to conquer. But in the face of the Iron Fangs, they were beginning to question whether that was enough. The immediate aftermath of the battle left the Warborn scattered across the ruins of the colony. The Iron Fang forces had retreated, but the cost of the clash was clear. Bodies of both human and alien littered the streets. The Warborn needed more, they needed to evolve. "We need intel," Jace muttered, his mind already shifting into tactical mode. "A full report on their capabilities. What we're up against here isn't something we've ever seen before." Kale eyed him for a moment before nodding. "We'll need to get deeper into their territory, start gathering intel on their strategy and technology. If we can figure out how they're organizing their forces, we might have a shot." Jace didn't like the idea of venturing into the heart of Iron Fang territory, but they didn't have much choice. This wasn't just about survival, it was about humanity's place in the galaxy. The Warborn were humanity's most advanced weapon, and if they didn't evolve in time, humanity might not survive. As they moved deeper into the Yaoyao war zone, Jace's thoughts shifted to the people they had sworn to protect. The Warborn had been bred with one purpose in mind: to fight for humanity, to preserve their species in a galaxy that was constantly shifting and changing. But after every battle, after every loss, the question kept rising: what would they do when the war was over? Would humanity be able to rebuild? Could they even survive if they lost this fight? And what about the Warborn themselves? They were not human. They were not like the others who had been born of flesh and blood, of love and loss. They had been created for a singular purpose, and they knew no other life. But as Jace looked at his comrades, he saw something in their eyes that troubled him. There was doubt. Doubt about who they were and what they had been made to become. In the quiet moments between battles, Jace had seen it, his comrades questioning whether the violence they were unleashing was truly worth it. They had been designed to be perfect soldiers, but in a war without honor, in a war with no clear end, what was the cost of perfection? Before he could dwell on it further, Kale's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "We've got movement up ahead." Jace's instincts kicked in, and he gestured for the team to fall into position. The ruins around them were eerily quiet, and the silence stretched long and unsettling. The war zone had been abandoned by the Iron Fangs for the moment, but Jace knew better than to assume they were safe. "What kind of movement?" Jace asked. Kale studied his visor for a moment before replying. "Unidentified. They're not making any noise. Could be a scout party, or it could be a trap." The tension between them was palpable. The Warborn had faced many enemies, but this felt different. They couldn't afford to make mistakes, not now. The squad moved through the darkened streets, their steps cautious but purposeful. Every corner could hide an ambush, every shadow could conceal an Iron Fang soldier. As they reached the central plaza of the colony, a strange high-pitched hum filled the air. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder, vibrating in their bones. "EMP pulse," Jace muttered under his breath, barely recognizing the sound before it hit them. "Brace for it." The surge of electromagnetic energy came crashing, down on them in an instant. The lights flickered and died, and every piece of technology, their suits, their weapons, their comms, went dead. The Warborn, though enhanced in many ways, were not immune to the consequences of such an attack. They fell to their knees, disoriented by the sudden loss of control. "What the hell is happening?" Kale growled, struggling to get to his feet. "I don't know," Jace answered, fighting the dizziness that threatened to overtake him. The EMP pulse had knocked out their systems, but it hadn't stopped the Iron Fangs. It had only given them an advantage. They were vulnerable now, and the Iron Fangs knew it. The ambush came swiftly. Figures cloaked in black armor, their movements fluid and unnatural, emerged from the shadows like predators closing in on their prey. The Warborn struggled to regain control of their systems, but it was too late. The enemy was already upon them. Jace's senses flared as he reached for his sidearm, but the moment he did, an Iron Fang soldier was on him, its claws slashing through the air with lethal precision. Jace managed to sidestep the strike, using his enhanced reflexes to narrowly avoid the deadly blow. But the Iron Fang soldier wasn't alone. More materialized from the shadows, each one faster, stronger, and more skilled than the last. "Get up!" Jace shouted, though his voice barely cut through the chaos. Kyle and the others struggled to their feet, but they were not used to fighting in such disorienting conditions. The Warborn had been bred for speed and strength, but without their technology they were just soldiers, human after all. The battle was intense and brutal. The Warborn fought valiantly, but the enemy was everywhere, overwhelming them with superior tactics. For every Iron Fang that fell, 2 more took its place, each more terrifying than the last. As Jace fought back-to-back with Kale, his mind raced. They couldn't keep this up. The Warborn were formidable, but they were not invincible. And the Iron Fangs knew this. They had seen the Warborn's strength and adapted to it. The tables had turned. Now it was the Warborn who were outmatched. And for the first time since their creation, Jace could hear the voices of doubt creeping in his mind. What if they were not humanity's saviors? What if they were just another mistake, a failed experiment in the name of survival? The battlefield had become a storm, a maelstrom of shattered metal and twisted bodies. The Warborn were no longer fighting just to survive. They were fighting for the soul of humanity itself. As the Iron Fangs advanced, their war machines looming, over the ruins of the colony, Jace Thorne felt the crushing weight of what was at stake. This wasn't just a battle for territory. It was a battle for identity, for legacy, for the future. Jace's team had regrouped, but they were battered, their energy reserves low, their bodies aching from the relentless assault. The EMP pulse had crippled their systems, and every move had to be calculated, every step taken with caution. The Iron Fangs were closing in, methodical and deadly. They were relentless, their superior tactics overwhelming the Warborn at every turn. Jace knew that unless they acted fast, the entire resistance would crumble. Kale's voice crackled through the comms, distorted but still audible. "We've got one shot at this, Jace. We can't keep running." Jace's heart pounded in his chest. The familiar calm that had always anchored him in battle was starting to slip away, replaced by a gnawing sense of desperation. He had always been able to rely on his instincts, on the enhancements that made him better than any human soldier. But now, facing an enemy that adapted faster than they could react, Jace was beginning to question everything he had been taught. "Deploying secondary charges now," Jace said, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his gut. "We'll take them down, or we'll go down with them. No more running." The Iron Fang general was just ahead, an imposing figure draped in dark armor, with eyes that burned with a savage intelligence. Jace had studied the Iron Fang tactics, had seen the reports from every battle before, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer terror that radiated from this being. The general was more than just a soldier. He was a symbol of everything that had stood in humanity's way for centuries. And now it was Jace's turn to confront that legacy. As the Warborn moved into position, Jace felt the weight of their resolve settle over him. The squad had been through countless skirmishes, but this was different. This was the final fight, the one that would either elevate humanity into the ranks of the galaxy's great powers, or see them crushed beneath the heel of the Iron Fangs. The air was thick with tension as Jace's fingers hovered over the detonator. The final charge was set. They had no more options, no more contingencies. It was all or nothing. Kale and the others held their ground, weapons raised, waiting for the signal. The Iron Fangs were in their sights, their soldiers moving with precise, synchronized steps. The war machines, towering structures of mechanical horror, slowly advanced toward their position. "Do it now, Jace." Kale's voice cut through the static, and Jace's finger slammed down on the trigger. The explosion tore through the silence. The ground shook, a deafening blast that sent shockwaves through the battlefield. The Iron Fangs stumbled, their lines broken by the blast as smoke and debris filled the air. For a moment, there was nothing but chaos, shattered metal, the screech of torn machinery, and the screams of soldiers caught in the blast. Jace didn't hesitate. His enhanced body moved like lightning, propelling him forward as he sprinted toward the Iron Fang general, his comrades falling in behind him. The general had survived the explosion, though the blast had left him staggering. His golden eyes, burning with a primal fury, locked onto Jace as he approached. "You cannot win." The general's voice was low, but it carried with an ancient weight. "Your species is nothing but a fleeting shadow. You will fall, just as all others have before you." Jace's heart hammered in his chest, but his resolve hardened. He was no longer fighting for survival. He wasn't even fighting for victory, not in the way the Iron Fang general understood. He was fighting for something deeper, for the idea that humanity could not only survive but thrive no matter the odds. "Maybe," Jace said, his voice a low growl, "but we'll go down fighting, and you'll remember our name long after you're gone." Without a knot, the breakthrough came in an instant. Jace feigned a strike to the general's left, then spun and drove his blade into the alien's side. The general roared in pain, his body faltering as Jace's strike found its mark. But the alien was relentless, pulling itself up even as the blood, black and viscous, oozed from the wound. The general's eyes narrowed, a feral gleam igniting in his gaze. "This is not the end of us," the general hissed, staggering back. "You are not the first to challenge us, and you will not be the last." Jace stood tall, his chest heaving, but his expression unwavering. "Maybe," he said again, "but we're the first ones you won't forget." In that moment, the realization hit him. Victory wasn't about defeating the Iron Fangs. It was about defying the idea that they were invincible. Humanity's strength wasn't just in their weapons or their soldiers. It was in their refusal to be cowed by the impossible. The final blow came quickly. The general, weakened and staggering, made one last attempt to strike. But Jace anticipated it. With a fluid motion, he sidestepped, bringing his blade down with a brutal, decisive arc. The Iron Fang general collapsed, the light fading from his golden eyes as he hit the ground, a heap of twisted metal and flesh. The Warborn had won. But victory wasn't simple, nor was it clean. The battlefield fell silent, the screams of the dying replaced by the heavy breathing of the survivors. Jace stood over the fallen general, his chest tight, his heart still pounding. He had won. They had won. But at what cost? Kale approached, his face a mask of exhaustion. "We did it," he said quietly, but there was no joy in his voice. Jace looked down at the general's lifeless form, his mind swirling with the weight of their actions. They had won this battle, but it was only a single step in a war that would stretch across the stars. The victory was hard-earned, and it had come at a price. The Warborn had bled, and so had humanity. But the most painful realization was one that Jace knew all too well. The cost of this victory was far greater than they had ever anticipated, and yet despite everything, Jace knew this much. The war was far from over. It had only just begun. The aftermath of the battle was quiet, too quiet. The ground around the fallen Iron Fang general was littered with the wreckage of what had once been a symbol of galactic might. Now it was just debris, defeated, abandoned, forgotten. The Warborn stood in silence, their bodies battered and bloodied, their minds grappling with the gravity of what had just transpired. Jace Thorne's breath came in slow, measured intervals as he surveyed the battlefield. His hands were stained with the blood of both human and alien, and though his enhanced physiology had allowed him to survive the battle, it couldn't shield him from the weight of the victory. The cost had been steep. The Warborn had fought valiantly, but they had also lost comrades, friends, and their sense of invincibility. For the first time in his life, Jace questioned the path they had taken. Was it worth it? Was humanity's survival worth the bloodshed, the destruction, the loss of their very humanity? Kale approached, his steps heavy, the look on his face reflecting the same weariness Jace felt in his bones. "We did it. We've beaten the general," he said. But his words felt hollow, empty. "But the war isn't over. Not by a long shot." Jace nodded grimly. The battle had been a significant blow to the Iron Fangs, but it had only scratched the surface. The galaxy was vast, and the Iron Fangs had an entire empire to draw from. Their defeat here would not break them. The next wave would come, stronger, angrier, more determined than ever. "We won this battle, Kale. But I don't think the war was ever about winning," Jace murmured. His voice carried a weight that seemed to stretch across the battlefield. "It was about proving something." "Proving what?" Kale asked, his brows furrowing in confusion. "Proving that we are more than what they thought we were," Jace replied, his eyes drifting toward the sky. "That humanity can stand against them. That no matter what they do, we won't break, not this time." Kale didn't respond immediately, his gaze following Jace's. The two of them stood in the silence for a long moment, the only sound the crackling of the distant fires that still consumed the wreckage of the colony. The Warborn had been made for war, designed to fight, to adapt, to overcome. But now, in the aftermath of this victory, they were forced to reckon with the truth that had eluded them for so long. War came at a cost, and no one, no matter how powerful, could escape its toll. The Warborn moved to begin the slow process of securing the area. The Iron Fangs had been driven back, but there were still threats lurking in the depths of their empire. Jace knew they would have to regroup, to rebuild what had been lost. But the victory felt different now, hollowed out by the realization that the war was far from. The Warborn had come into existence for a singular purpose, to be the ultimate weapon, the final line of defense for humanity against a galaxy of forces far beyond their reach. But in the heat of battle, they had begun to realize that they were not just soldiers, they were individuals, each one with their own thoughts, their own desires, their own fears. The question of whether they were more than just weapons was no longer rhetorical. It was deeply personal. Jace stood alone for a moment, his hand resting on the ruined weapon that had once belonged to the Iron Fang general. The blade was still, slick with blood, the metallic scent heavy in the air. As he turned it over in his hands, he realized that the Warborn were no longer fighting for survival. They were fighting for a chance to shape their own destiny. They were fighting for humanity's future, yes, but they were also fighting for themselves. In the distance, the faint hum of engines echoed. The Warborn had secured the colony, but the rest of the galaxy was still out there, unknown and full of possibilities. New alliances would need to be forged. New enemies would rise from the shadows. The Warborn had proven their strength, but it was now time to prove their resilience, not just as soldiers, but as a new force in the galaxy. Kale approached again, his expression no less somber. "Jace, are we ready for what comes next?" Jace looked at him, his face hardening with resolve. "We have no choice. The fight has only just begun." Days passed, and the Warborn regrouped, their ranks now thinned by the carnage of battle. The survivors, Jace, Kale, Elia, and the others, stood as the remnants of humanity's hope, a testament to their ability to overcome even the most insurmountable odds. But despite the victory, there was no celebration, no moment of triumph. The reality of war had set in. The cost of survival had been paid in blood, and now the Warborn had to decide what to do with the fragile gift they had won. As Jace stood on the edge of the ruined colony, looking out at the stars, he felt the weight of it all. The victory had been hard-earned, but it had shown them something profound. Humanity, for all its flaws and weaknesses, had the potential to stand against the galaxy's greatest predators. They had the strength to survive, but the true test had yet to come. Could they rebuild? Could they evolve not just as warriors but as a society? Jace didn't have the answers. But for the first time, he felt the stirring of something greater than fear, something that was in its own way just as powerful. Hope. The Warborn would rise from the ashes, not just as soldiers, but as leaders. The galaxy was vast, and it had no shortage of dangers. But humanity's place in the stars had been secured. The battle had been won, but the true war was still ahead. There was no guarantee of victory, no certainty of survival. But Jace knew one thing for sure. Humanity was not going to go down without a fight, and as the stars stretched out before him, he understood. This was just the beginning. The sky above the Warborn encampment was still, the stars now visible in their full, shimmering brilliance. The aftermath of the battle had left the land scorched and scarred, but there was a quiet sense of resolve among the survivors. Humanity had not only faced the wrath of the Iron Fangs, it had stood against it. And for the first time, it felt as if the universe had paused, unsure of what to make of the species it had long dismissed as fragile and insignificant. Jace Thorne stood alone at the edge of the camp, his eyes fixed on the stars. The weight of the future pressed on him. The Warborn had won, yes. They had survived the impossible. But what now? What kind of future would humanity create in this galaxy? One that had once seemed so vast, so indifferent to their existence. Behind him, Kale approached, his footsteps heavy in the dirt. "You've been standing here for hours," Kale remarked, his voice low, almost uncertain. "You're thinking about the future, aren't you?" Jace nodded slowly. "I'm thinking about everything. About the war, about what we've become and what's waiting out there. The Iron Fangs aren't the only ones who will come for us. We've made enemies, Kale. And more importantly, we've made allies." Kale's eyes flickered with the same uncertainty Jace had felt growing inside him ever since the battle had ended. The galaxy was a place of shifting alliances, ancient powers, and new frontiers. Humanity had taken its first step into a much larger universe, and there was no turning back. The victory had been hard won, but the next challenge loomed. On the horizon. "We may have beaten the Iron Fangs," Kale said quietly. "But there are other forces out there. The war has only just begun." Jace turned to face him, his expression hard but determined. "I know. But we're not the same as we were before. We've proven that we can fight. And we've proven that humanity's place in the galaxy is more than just surviving.